for the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Open Highway. This is your host, Eric Erickson. It's great to have you back. Today's topic, let's get right into it. Indian affairs, for lack of a better term. So I grew up in Northwest Washington, and I grew up right next to a number of reservations, and I am the first to admit that my education was a bit lacking when it came to Indian history. Even as a youth, we had what were called Washington State education classes, where we learned about the history of the region, and at one point we were even taken on a tour of the entire state. And the majority of what I was taught about was white history, Lewis and Clark expedition, the Oregon Trail. And when it came to Native Americans, it was definitely a small part of what we were taught. They were definitely secondary cast members in the story of the Northwest at best. There were a few that were taught about a little bit. Sacagawea or Sacagawea, depending on how you pronounce her name. She definitely was one that came up, but that was about it. That was really it. There were a lot of political issues growing up that at the time I was young, I didn't really understand what it was about, but fishing issues was really a big thing. I remember hearing about water rights, about land use. These were definitely things that I heard about, but you're 12, 13, 14 years old. The last thing you care about is fishing nets in the river when you just care about getting your driver's license. And then I went off to college, California, and kind of left it all behind me. But I really wanted to do a show where we dive into some of this, not just the history and not just the treatment of the Native people, but also like the terminology. How do we address this? How do we talk about it? Native American, indigenous people, Indians, which terms do we use? Why do we use certain terms? So I was lucky enough to be connected with Lailani Upham and her brother Titus, who run the Iron Shield Creative in Montana, which is a really interesting storytelling cultural group that is bringing the history and the lives of the Blackfeet Nation to anybody who wants to hear about them. They conduct storytelling tours, classes, workshops, and they are joining me today. And we're going to talk about a lot of subjects. I think it's really fascinating, some of the things that we get into. And I think you're going to find it very interesting too. So that's what we're talking about today, and we'll be right back after this with Lailani and Titus. Stay tuned. Hey everybody, have you checked out the VikingDogStore.com yet? The Viking Dog Store offers motivational shirts in a variety of styles, designs, and colors, and a portion of the proceeds of each sale are donated to wolf rescue organizations. That's right, you can get an amazing shirt and also help save the wolves. What's more, the Viking Dog Store also has a special line of wolf-related shirts that provide 100% of their proceeds to wolf rescue. That's right, 100%. You can choose from a number of designs including Save the Wolves, Leader of the Pack, or simply I Love Wolves. And every penny of profit from these shirts will be donated directly to Wolf Rescue. So visit thevikingdogstore.com and get your shirts today. Perfect for the gym or just wearing on a daily basis, there are various styles and colors for men, women, and even kids. thevikingdogstore.com. Motivate your workout and help us help save these amazing animals. thevikingdogstore.com. Check it out today. So we're here with Lailani Upham of the Iron Shield Creative in Montana and her brother Titus Upham. Hello, thanks for joining me today.
Hi.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's so great that you could talk to me about the subject. So just tell me to start off with, what is Iron Shield?
Iron Shield Creative is a consulting kind of business. We just started in March of 2021 this year, and it's under the umbrella of Indigenous storytelling. And it encompasses quite a bit under that umbrella, which is basically workshops and consulting services. So the workshops are held out on the landscape on the Blackfeet ancestral homelands, the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. We take people out and talk about the history. We talk about our oral traditional stories and anything that folks are really interested in. And through those stories, we try to connect these people to the understanding and the untold stories of our people and our history, and especially Glacier National Park. We are on the border of Glacier National Park, and our people, the Blackfoot Confederacy, has lived in this area for tens of thousands of years, and people do not really understand or realize that when they come into the park. We at this point can't get into the park to do this kind of storytelling yet, so we do it which borders the park with folks that are coming to visit.
Why can't you get into the park?
That is a little controversial and difficult situation right now. What we understand is they only have certain companies that can contract with the park. It's not, I don't think it's like that in all national parks, but this particular one, there's only one company called Glacier Guides who's been in there for 30 some years. And they're the only guide company that can go on foot and bring people out there commercially. We do have a Blackfeet company that does, they're called Sun Tours, and they do bus tours through the park, and they tell of the history and the stories and things like that. So they've been in existence at least for 30 some years as well. But as far as going on foot, they're the only ones that can do it.
So is it a situation where it's just, hopefully it's a business situation where eventually you'll be able to have that access?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to be working on that. But the other thing too is not just the workshops out on the landscape, but my background is journalism and photojournalism and filmmaking. So I use that I guess skill that I acquired over the years, and teaching also at a tribal college. And so I promote and do workshops for tribal businesses or schools or things like that under that umbrella of video production, maybe photojournalism and filmmaking, and telling our stories.
So let me get right to the question then. Explain to me, why is this so important? What's the? I know that your grandfather was a storyteller. I listened to there's an audio tape of him telling a tale, and it was really compelling to listen to this being handed down. So explain to me and to the audience, like, why is this so vital? Why is it important?
Well, first of all, it's really important because our people of all tribes, indigenous tribes in North America, have been here for the beginning of time. And when you think about America, it's only been here for over 200 some years. And even Montana is 1869, I believe. And much of the history that's taught in the schools or even out on the road signs right here in Montana, in our home state, you don't see or hear of our history. Sure, you might hear of a little bit of massacres here and there, but that's not all of it.
Mhm.
And so what better way is to take people out on the landscape to really learn and hear the accuracy of our stories. And not only that, but one of my things of why I teach is because I want to teach Indigenous students, whatever age they are, to tell their own story. Very thankful for all the authors and people that kept journals back in the 1800s, 1700s, and we have that documentation. But now times have changed, and it's time for us to step up to the board and be authors and filmmakers, videographers, writers, to tell our story from the way we hear it. Because even in the books that we have of the Blackfoot history, they're pretty good. But then when you hear it from an elder around here, you sit and talk with them. As you know, as a journalist, you could sit and just visit and listen. The carried down oral traditional stories, or that history of what our elders from their elders have told them, are quite different sometimes than what you see in those books.
Right.
So it's really important, I feel, to train and help and encourage our people to tell our stories. So through even Iron Shield Creative with our folks around the reservation, just recruiting people to come on board to go out and tell the stories, and they end up loving it.
Has there been, what's been the elder generation, and maybe this is going back a little bit further, but what has been the response to using modern forms of filmmaking, and audio's been around for a while, but is there an excitement about actually documenting this for a wider audience? I mean, what's been the response from the elder generation, or even stories maybe you've heard from, like when your grandfather was actually recorded? What was the response to that? How did they take to it?
Well, I can't speak from the sense of what Grandpa Joe's generation thought, but I'm assuming that it was welcomed and it was something that they felt was really important.
Mm.
Therefore, that's why Grandpa Joe recorded that history, that documentation of our ancestors, of our family being massacred on the Marias River. And he felt strong about bringing that story forth.
So it was important to share. It was important they felt the importance to share their culture with other people and get the truth out as to
I
what
believe
went
so.
down. Okay.
I believe so. And today I feel like there's a lot of encouragement and I wouldn't say excitement, because our elders don't get like, you're so excited, but when they say, yeah, that's good, that there is excited. And they're long as we have that support.
Word reached the Army that Owl Child was being hid out at Mountain Chief's camp, which was located on the Marias River. So out of Fort Shaw, they sent Army Officer Eugene Baker, along with 55 mounted men, to deal with Mountain Chief for harboring a murderer and to take Owl Child in for the murder of Clark. But in the meantime, word reached Mountain Chief that the Army was looking for him, and his camp, they both camped in Little Winter, moved way down the river, about 10 miles on the Marias. Sometime later, my grandfather, Mountain Chief, moved Heavy Runner. My parental grandfather came across Mountain Chief's vacant campsite, and being he and his band were looking for a place to make camp, this seemed like a good spot because the snow was all cleared to set up their lodges. You see, Heavy Runner's camp was up around Old Agency, and they moved down into the Mirage Valley. It's sheltered down there in the wintertime. So that's the reason why they happened to be down on the Mirage River looking for a spot, and they ran right into Mountain Chief's Bacon camp. So after Heavy Runner's group was settled, he sent his young men off to hunt for buffalo in the Sweetgrass Hills, which was about 40 or 50 miles, and it took 3 or 4 days to make the round trip, which was the Heavy Runner camp unguarded against the hostile forces. But the chief was not worried because he had his papers, documents, treaties, and so forth on his person, which were issued out of Washington, D.C., showing that he was and his people were in harmony with the United States government at the time. The morning of the day that the Baker Massacre took place, a young, still in his teenager by the name of Bearhead, which was the first cousin of my father, comes with Rattle, was out looking for his horses when he ran into Major Baker's 55 soldiers, which was being guarded by the Indian scout named Joe Kipp. Major Baker ordered one of his men to seize Bearhead and said if he tries to warn his camp to shoot him down like a dog. Joe Kipp, the Indian scout, told Major Baker that he was going to attack the wrong camp. This camp belonged to Chief Heavy Runner and set Mountain instead of Mountain Chief. But Major Baker said, what difference did it make? An Indian is an Indian. And when Kipp protested, Major Baker ordered 2 soldiers to guard him also and keep him from giving any warning to the Heavy Runner camp.
This is kind of a myth-busting opportunity right here. There's a misconception that the history of many tribes are the same. That unfortunately, there's the misconception of just kind of lumping Native Americans into one basket, and this is an opportunity where you can show your individual traditions, your individual history, your individual culture, and show how the Blackfeet are a nation and have their individual way of life that's been going on for thousands of years. How does that play when people start to see that you have a different tradition than the Cherokee, or you have a different tradition than the Iroquois, or whatever? What happens with that? Like, I'm just really curious. Like, are people interested? Are they shocked? Are they like, wow, they admit that they thought that it was all the same? I mean, because it's a unique tradition, every single one.
Yeah, maybe I'll let Titus tackle that question, and I could chime in too.
Yeah, well, when I was in military, in basic training and in military, that's when I first started to see that a lot of people thought we were just all the same. That all Indians lived in teepees, all Indians, and some thought I still lived in a teepee. You know, they were asking, what's it like to live in a teepee, you know, and after a while, I kind of got tired of explaining, getting too many questions on what it's like to live in a teepee, and I just started telling them, well, I got a 2-story teepee, you know, I got my satellite outside, and, you know, I kind of start having fun with it. But yeah, there is kind of a general, I think, consensus out there sometimes that all tribes are pretty much the same, which it's not, obviously. And I get really interested in learning about other tribes. I travel to a lot of reservations in United States and in Canada. And there is some things that are common, but in many, many ways, were very, very different. I went to a school, college in Kansas. It was, at the time it was called Haskell Indian Junior College, and now it's called Haskell Indian Nations University. But I went down there to got a basketball scholarship, went down there to play basketball. And when I got down there was Navajos. There was tribes of names that I didn't even realize were tribes. I thought one tribe was a can of pop. It was called Kickapoo. Found out it's a real tribe, and they're real Kickapoo people, you know. And so it was kind of, and so I got to meet all these tribes. And one thing I noticed is that the Southwest athletes that came from the Southwest, like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, a lot of the tribes from that part of the country were the cross-country runners. Like they could really, really run cross-country. They were small build and very slender. And then I noticed the tribes that came from the coast, whether that would be the East Coast or the West Coast, they were all our football players because they were all very stocky. They were built very solid, the coastal Indians. And then all of us kind of from the plains and the northern plains and some from Oklahoma, we were like all the basketball players, volleyball team players, because we were all tall and slender. And so I noticed that the different regions of the country, those tribes were kind of like gifted in a sport. And I was like, wow, that's pretty neat. We just kind of all fell into our rightful place because I'm 6'4" and 170 pounds soaking wet. I wouldn't want to play football, you know, broken half. And so football was not my interest, but the coastal Indians, I noticed they were good football players and they were very solid. We had some folks from Alaska that were on the football team. They were very solid boys, and the girls were solid too. But yeah, that was one thing I thought was kind of neat, just from the different regions of the country that these tribes came from. They really adapted to a certain sport because of their build. And so that was one of the first things I really noticed.
Had you really left Montana before you went to college? Or was that the first time you kind of ventured out to the other part of the country?
Well, no, I had left Montana prior to that, up into Canada, and mostly though just the Northwest, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, somewhat down into Arizona, but mostly just the Northwest. I never did go down too far south or east. I never even been to the Dakotas until I went to Kansas. And that's when I really got a bigger picture of a lot of tribes.
So not just as a Blackfeet, but as just a human being. Like when you went to college, was that the first time? Like, was it a culture shock? Was it, really seeing another part of the country? Because I can speak from personal experience. I grew up in Northwest Washington.
Yeah.
And until I was 18 and I went to college, like I'd never left. I think I went to Disneyland once, so it's just as a person, suddenly you see this other side of life. But was there a culture shock there for you to kind of see not only how other parts of the country, but other natives lived and learning about their cultures and the way that what they brought to things?
It was somewhat of a culture shock, especially the geography. Because like Lonnie said, where we lived here forever, this part of the country here in Alberta and Montana, and we always were adjacent to the Rocky Mountain front. So when I got to Kansas, pretty flat there, and that was one of my big culture shocks, was the geography. It was just prairie every way you looked. And I was used to having the mountains to the west, and that kind of grounded me. So it was hard to really get my direction down right, being there for a while, because I needed the mountains. The mountains were really my way of direction and knowing. And So it took a while to finally kind of get direction, and being able to know which way was west, north, east, and south. Unless the sun was coming up or setting, it was kind of tough for a while there because I had no mountains to direct me. And
I get that, and I get that because growing up, I grew up on the West Coast,
yes,
and the ocean was always to the
yes,
west. And then
right,
I end up in Chicago for a while, and suddenly you have this lake which is as big as an ocean, but it's in
yeah.
the east, and it messes with your internal
It messes
compass.
with you, man. Yeah, it really messed with me for a while. It's just the every direction was prairie, and I wasn't used to that at all. And then
Can you?
also,
No, go
oh,
ahead.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
Then also we'd be watching a baseball game or football, mostly baseball at the time, and coming across the bottom of the TV screens would be tornado warning.
Mhm.
And when I would see tornado warning, man, I'm ready to run, And I noticed all the Oklahoma guys and the Kansas guys, they're just watching the game, And I'm like, hey, there's a tornado warning. We got to get out here. They just laugh at me. And, and they were used to that. That was normal for them to see tornado warning come across the TV screen. It wasn't for me. I never seen a tornado in my life. Yeah, there was a lot of things I had to get used to. The humidity was something else, man. I could not handle humidity in October because in Montana, October is pretty cool and dry. And it's like, it's October, it should be cooling off by now, and it's not.
So let me use the opportunity again to ask another question. So terminology: Native American, First Nations, Indian, Indigenous. There's all this hang up with which term is proper to use, and what I've kind of learned is it depends on the person. If like you use the term Indian, I've heard other people use Native American. There's a discussion that's being had over that. I think a lot of people, especially from my background, don't know what to use or don't know what to ask. So talk to me about that. Like, what term do you use? Why do you use it? What's your opinion on that whole discussion?
Well, I use, particularly lately, I've been using indigenous, and I think it's because of
Mhm.
just the shift that I've had on telling our stories here where we live, because we're indigenous people of this land. The other term I've been using is First Nations as well, but I think indigenous. But we grew up using the term Indian, and we still do in our community. We still call each other Indians, and the Indians from across the mountains or whatever, because that was a term that we just used. And I think I went through a phase of using Native American, American Indian, but I didn't feel comfortable with it. Just used it because it was just the term to use. And now I don't particularly want to use that because, like I said, America is so young and it's only been here in certain existence, and then it doesn't, even that terminology and that language really gears away from us. Even with the history of the treaties, those treaties were us, the Indian, the Native American, or the indigenous, whatever you want to call it, First Nations tribes, make an agreement with the United States government. But when you try to understand it or hear it in the history books, it always seems like, oh, the United States are making treaties with the tribes. No, it was us making those treaties with them. So then when you put those terms, Native American or American Indian, again, you put that superiority of the US government and this early a country in superiority, and you forget about our people who are indigenous to this land. So that's my answer.
That's well put. What about you, Titus?
Well, I think too, it just kind of depends on who you're talking to, your demographic, or maybe what group of people you're talking with. Like there's some groups here on the Blackfeet, they'll call us Bikani, and Bikani is a real name, and we got we're what we call the Blackfoot Confederacy, but there's three bands. There's the Bigani, the Siksika, and the Kainai. And so the Kainai people refer to themselves as Kainai, and we're talking to them, then we say, well, we're Bigani. And the other band is there that, well, I'm Siksika. And so among the bands, we say our traditional name. To the general public, we'll say we're the Blackfoot Confederacy. That's kind of our general name for all three bands, you know. And then from there, we can say First Nations, Indigenous, you know, Native American after that, American Indian, whatever one, I guess fits the group that you're talking with. Myself, neither of the names are offensive to me, but I know to some people it can be. Like our basketball team, our football team, our cross-country team here, they're called the Browning Indians. I lived in a little community called Star School. We were Star School Indians. And another community on the reservation, they were called the Heartbeat Warriors. So, you know, it just, but there's some groups that will be kind of offended. I noticed a lot of the groups that do get offended in ways of terminology are your urban Indians compared to the Indians that live on the reservation, the natives.
Really?
Yeah, so there's kind of a difference there. So that the urbans, they would most likely want to be called indigenous or maybe Native American. Whereas the natives that stay on the reservations, it's not that big of a deal.
Sometimes that's why I wanted to ask you that, because I'm like, let's just ask the damn question, which is, you know, it's a word. It's, you know, what works best for you. And like you said, I'm sure there's somebody else who I could ask, and they're like, well, you know, I like the term First People. Awesome. We've gotten to know you. I'll use that term. You know, whatever. It's, you know, it's that discussion that's fun to have and actually hop over that and say, hey, let's figure this out. Let's talk about that. So as long as we're talking about fun stuff like this, what about cultural appropriation? How do you feel about that? Like, we have the whole mascot thing going on right now. How do you feel about the changes that are happening in that?
That was going to be my next comment. A lot of that is starts out as an urban movement, and so that was a native urban movement. Redskins, okay, so that was a kind of an urban movement to change the name on the Redskins. The Chiefs, Kansas City Chiefs, but not really. You don't hear it on the reservation. You don't hear anybody saying anything. I see a lot of natives from a lot of the reservation tribes. They always have on Redskin hats. You know, and like they kind of like the name. But it's just off the reservation. Many times it's coming from your urban communities that want to make these changes, or somebody that moves, let's say, moves back to the reservation from the city. They're coming back very as activists. And you know, they kind of sometimes they'll stir up the tribe, and they'll get the tribal council behind them. You know, and so once they have the tribal council stamp, you know, then they try to move forward again with their agenda. But on the reservation, they don't really get caught up in that kind of a stuff. Our thing here is land issues, water rights. For example, Glacier National Park, that's a 99-year lease, you know, and that lease was up about 18 years ago. And so we'd like to see the federal government figure out what they're going to do about returning Glacier National Park to us, are giving us some kind of a recompense, you know, some kind of a payment for keeping our mountains. So those are the kind of stuff we're concerned about.
Right. So now that the Secretary of the Interior is a Native American woman for the first time. Like, do you see that as a hope? Do you see that maybe things might come from that?
I kind of had some hope there on that. I'm hoping that the case could be brought before her, because we also have what we call the disputed strip here on the Blackfeet Nation. And so the disputed strip is, there's an area from where the Blackfeets call it the rocks, where the rocks leave the ground and go up into the sky. That's the mountains. Okay, so the elder said when we leased that to the United States, we only leased the rocks. We didn't lease the ground. Okay, but there's maybe about a 10-mile strip there from the mountains eastward. And that strip, we call it the disputed strip. And so we really don't let Glacier National Park put too much fences up. And they always want to put a fence up. Their justification is the ranchers' cattle is coming into the park. So we want to fence it. The tribal council won't let them fence it, because then that's just our way of agreeing to say, okay, yeah, we lease the whole land and the mountains to you guys. So we will not let no fences go up all along the park. So that's called the disputed strip. So things like that is our concern. So with this Native American lady that's in her now, hopefully that could be visited again. And but once we take it that far, we got really one shot to hit a home run. If not, then we lose out on it. So it's something that they haven't really jump to right away. It's something you really want to build a solid case, because you got one shot. And if we lose, then that's it, man. There's nothing,
You'll be dead! You'll be dead like everybody else!
Would you still be her big soldier?
He ordered us to sterilize the women.
An entire agenda to wipe my bloodline from a nation because of who I am.
It's what you want to believe.
The award-winning film from Viking Dog Entertainment.
You destroyed their lives and I knew them! And then you did it!
I didn't do it!
I don't believe you. Are you an evil man? Or are you just a man who did evil things?
Truth. Available on streaming platforms, Blu-ray, and DVD. It's interesting what you bring up, because I know that you have had some rough goes there in your area lately. COVID has hit you guys pretty hard. All the reservations have had problems with COVID. But also you had a very tragic the young girl that was lost recently.
Yes.
So you guys have had a lot of problems. So to hear that, it kind of puts it in perspective, because you hear somebody come in and be like, we've got to get upset about the Atlanta Braves. We've got to get upset about, the Chicago Blackhawks. And it's like, well, you know what? We have day-to-day things that we're just dealing with. So it really puts it in perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of add to that where, what Titus was talking about is, as far as like we have our own real, I guess you could say, face-to-face issues that are happening on our reservations. And I'm from also other reservations. My mother is from the Fort Belknap, the Ani and the Nakota people, which is east of our Blackfeet reservation. I'm enrolled Blackfeet, but I have all other bloods in me as well. And my grandfather, who I'm also a part of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, that's the Dakota tribe over in South Dakota. I also have that blood in me. And then I also live part-time on the Flathead Reservation, which is the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. So I kind of speak from a lot of different reservations around this area, where Titus is right. We don't hear a lot of people hollering around about, the Washington Redskins or, those mascot things, because we have things that are in our families that really need to be brought to the forefront, that we need to get pretty upset about, and find the rights to these kind of things. In fact, like he said, growing up, we were kind of proud of those little logos and emblems of, some recognition of some tribes, that redskin logo. And in fact, one of our old society drum groups that still sing and they're award winning is the Young Gray Horse Singers from here on the Blackfeet Reservation. They even went over there to one of the DC games and opened it up with songs, and recognition. And so when I see that and feel it, it's like, there are some things that it definitely does come from the urban community, and I don't want to speak on why they feel so strong about it, because you can hear the rhetoric out there, but we have things that are a lot more close to home, and we're kind of gathered together as a family in a tight-knit community. And just like Titus was talking about, the undisputed strip, which is also called the ceded strip. And there's a history there that a lot of people, even in our own community, don't realize or understand. And that goes back to the Agreement of 1895. The Agreement of 1895 is an agreement that our Blackfeet people, of course, had with the government. And let's go back just a little ways. So the Lame Bull Treaty of 1855. So think about that time frame, 1855. Many of the tribes came together for that treaty, and that treaty was really basically a peace treaty and a kind of a shared hunting ground treaty. So that peace treaty said that, folks could kind of go through that territory. So back then in 1855, the US government recognized our Blackfoot Confederacy territory in this area, as Titus had talked about, all the way up to the Saskatchewan River up in Alberta, on down into the North Dakota area, South Dakota, coming down to the Elk River, which is Yellowstone River, and on into the Rockies, which is Glacier National Park area, and all the national forest areas over there. But basically the whole state of Montana, as we know it today, was Blackfoot territory. And the US government understood that, they recognized that. That's in that Lame Bull Treaty. And so I wanted to correct myself. The Montana came into existence in 1889. So go back, 1895 is that agreement. And that's before Montana was even here. So if we go back a little bit further to 1815, there was a gentleman that became really good friends with the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Blackfoot people. He married in, and there's also some books and documents that he did. His name was Hugh Monroe, came from back east. And 1815, he kind of did an average of 10 people per lodge, and he counted around 40,000 Blackfeet at that time. So 1855, during that agreement, by then, as you know, some of our history is diseases, the loss of buffalo, the greed for gold, and a lot of people coming out here westward were trying to take over this landscape because they really, for the most part, wanted that gold. And so Glacier National Park is one of them, is one of those areas they thought there was gold. So let's get that from the Indians. And so they, 1855, we're kind of diminishing by then from disease, loss of way of life, because the buffalo was everything to us spiritually as well. Everything about the buffalo we learned, and that's what we knew. And so by 1895, during that agreement of the ceded strip, which Titus was talking about, that by then our people kind of learned a little bit, these broken promises, the crookedness, the interpretations that weren't really accurate. And those interpretations, if you think about, what happened in those interpretations, there was only one interpreter, and they would, just interpret whatever. They didn't have what they call in the legal terms, when you go into contracts, a meeting of the minds, which is they all come together, that they all come together and talk about this and really get to that understanding. Many, many discussions before you sign an agreement. That wasn't done with our treaties. So by 1895, okay, right around that time frame was what we know as the Blackfoot, is the starvation winter. Really bad winter. We lost a lot of people from sicknesses, starvation, and by then we were getting, it was happening where we were almost more dependent on the U.S. government, because all of our way of life was already taken. Language is getting taken. Our ceremonies, our ways of being was being taken. And so right around then, I was told that we were down to 2,500 people, right around 1890, 90s, mid 90s. And so during that agreement, there were people that came into this area that really wanted gold. So they were like, they want to get this beautiful area. And I was told, I'm not going to say his name, but he's really known for one of the founders and conservationists of Glacier National Park back in the day, helped start it. But he had some insight that he thought there might be gold there. So negotiated with the Blackfoot tribe that trying to get that landscape from our people, because we were starving. But we put up a number, and I don't remember, it's in one of my notebooks, how many millions of dollars we said, okay. But they were like, no, don't be foolish. You're not going to get that. You're going to get this. So it ended up being like $1.5 million that they pretty much gave us pennies. But like I said, in that agreement, they had learned a little bit by then. And what they had learned was that they retained some rights, like Titus is talking about. So they retained every right in that landscape, which is Glacier National Park, and some of the national forests, which is called the Lewis and Clark National Forest, which is borders along the Blackfeet Reservation. So they retained almost every right except for the rock mineral. Rock mineral is gold. So they were like, okay, you could have that, but we retained the timber, the hunting, the fishing, the gathering of our medicines and our foods there, our way into that area. There's many other rights that we retained when you really talk and think about land law. And so they went ahead and did that. So that's in the 1895 agreement. It still stands as is. And so there's a little history there as well with after Glacier National Park came into existence in 1910, there was some Blackfeet men that went in there to do some hunting. And they took it to court, and basically, and make a long story short, the judge at the time ruled that they had violated something, which they hadn't, if you look at the 1895 agreement. And so systematically, our people were kind of like, our rights weren't really pushed or exercised, and it lied dormant for many, many years. And then sometime, I think it was in the 80s, Woody Kipp, who lives here on the reservation, now considered an elder, he's been a teacher, he's a journalist as well, an author. He challenged it in Supreme Court and challenged some things, as far as our rights with that agreement. And that's kind of how we get into the park now. We can exercise a lot of our rights. But now,
it's definitely not simple.
It's not.
I think some people think, it's just one thing happened, it led to this, and that's how it gets to there. But it's so convoluted, and opinions. And I have to latch on to the one thing that kind of spoke to me, and what you just said was, when the initial treaties were signed, you have one interpreter, it was kind of pushed through, and you're dealing with a nation. You're dealing with a group of people. And if it was any other nation, if it was any other group of people, it would have been and this isn't a modern thing. This is going back anytime in history, anytime the United States signed a treaty or something with another country or group of people, it would have been a huge event, and it would have been legal minds, and it would have been interpreters, and it would have been hundreds of people involved in the process. But that didn't happen.
And it didn't happen. It was quick. So, for example, like our Titus's great uncle, our great uncle, he's a chief. He's still alive today. He's 93, isn't he? Chief Earl Olperson. So he's been our chief and on council for decades upon decades since a young man. And he's a keeper of our knowledge. He grew up with elders, and he just knows so much. And he talked about with our tribal attorney way back in the day, I think probably the 70s, 80s, when he had to interpret for some elders up in Canada at one of the sister tribes up there on some certain agreements. And it was really hard to interpret some of the language and the things that were being said because it was just hard. And so they had that discussion of, well, if he's having a hard time, translating, and he's very fluent in the language, how much harder would it have been back then? But yet they only had one interpretation time frame, and this was it, and that's that. Plus the language is so different. One of the things about, you think about our language, the English language is a noun-based language, and our Blackfoot language and many indigenous language are verb-based. So everything that we see and know is living and moving, and there's action to it. But our English language is just really tough. As you know, it's not even really a language. It's borrowed from all sorts of languages. And so when you put that into to context, and you think about that, it's just everything has been just, and that's what I'm talking about as far as like I get on a tangent here because this is some of the history that everybody doesn't know about, including some of our tribal communities don't really realize that. And so these kind of things are way more important to get out there so that we could start exercising some of those rights that we actually have, right? Because they've lied dormant. We've kind of systematically been pushed down by the government or by society in general because we're forgotten people. So now, for example, the ceded strip is what our undisputed strip is a language that we heard it called from elders upon elders upon elders that lived in that time frame of what happened. And now that's a whole other story that we could go into, but what they call it now is the Badger 2 medicine. The Badger 2 medicine area is a term that was brought up, which I heard from our tribal attorney back in the 80s when oil development was trying to be threatened in that area, which is a really sacred area of our people. But even calling it, and the environmentalists are the ones who started with that term. And then there's a lot of other groups that came on board to protect that area, which we're very thankful for. But as of last year, there was a legislation that was introduced, and it's called the Badger 2 Medicine Protection Act. And that act basically is protecting that area, which is wonderful. But all those other groups, agriculturals, anglers, hunters, outdoor enthusiasts, environmentalists, other groups, and the Blackfeet Nation as well, have in that legislation and in that act have management of that area, which is the National Forest area. And of all the 9 people, there's only one Blackfeet on that table. And when you go back to the agreement of 1895, really the Blackfeet Nation should be the ones in management of that area. So as of this year, our like you're going back to the Native American being in the Department of Interior right now, the timing is right. Like Titus said, we have one shot at it. Us as a Blackfeet Nation have pulled our support of that Badger 2 Medicine Act. We pulled out of it. we've pushed forward some new legislation, and that is basically, I don't have the name in front of me, it's pretty long, but basically asking for that that area back. So not Glacier National Park, but the National Forest area. And so when you say the Badger 2 medicine and the ceded strip or the undisputed strip, when you keep calling it that, like I was talking about the language of Native America, American Indian, you kind of take away that meaning, and let's call it really what it is. It's the ceded strip.
And it comes back to, again, it's not simple. And I think so many people just think, oh, well, it's just, it's this one treaty, or it's this one misunderstanding, or it's this one, and it's not. Nothing in life is simple, so it's a misconception. So let's get back to Iron Creative. Let's talk about Iron Creative, because I think it's so cool what you guys are doing, and I want to make sure we spend some time on that. So what's you were telling me when we were talking earlier, you're still growing, and then with COVID it kind of like held down a little bit with some of the programs you could do. So we're all coming out of that. Hopefully it'll blossom. But walk me through some of the you do a walk with storytelling in the actual locations, and I've seen the photos, and they're really amazing pictures. I can only imagine what it'd be like to be sitting there listening, looking out over this land. So can you walk me through really quickly, like what one of these walks is like, and what happens and what's offered on it?
Yeah, so all of our story guides are right here from the Blackfeet Reservation, and they all carry different knowledge and understanding of the history and the culture and our ways and language. So every walk, or we call them cultural workshops, and but we throw in hike because you're kind of hiking, but for the most part you're just out on this beautiful landscape and learning. And so for the most part we have different themes. So it depends on the story guide who goes out with us. That will kind of determine what theme and stories there'll be. I'm on all of them, so I will give like the history that I just gave you, the cedar strip, and all, and that understanding. And everybody has been very, very moved by that understanding, because they didn't know. And so it's like some of them, could be plant identification, what plants we use, what plants are maybe gone, some of the climate change issues that are happening right now. Some are like the oral traditional stories. There's songs. We've got some singers and drummers that'll bring their drum out, and through many of our stories are old stories. There's always a song related to it, so they'll their hand drum and sing. If we don't have a singer with us, we have our Chief Earl Old Person on recording. So I bring out a Bose stereo, and during lunch we just listen to Chief Earl Old Person tell a story, sing a songs, and it's so beautiful. Earl Old Person. Yeah, look him up. He's done a lot of things over in DC for our tribe over the decades.
Amazing. So do you have a favorite story or a favorite tale or portion of history that you like to tell, or that you like to hear, or is there a personal favorite of yours? Titus too. I want to same question.
Yeah. There are some favorites, and I just pulled Titus in on this. I'm doing that almost like weekly. I'm pulling in. I still have some more story guides to put up on the website that have agreed to do this, and they have so much to bring to the board. And so Titus finally agreed, because he's been with me on some of my volunteer hikes that I did years ago for an organization to get our stories out there. So he's been there kind of telling some of our oral traditional stories. But one of my favorites, and Titus doesn't even know this, but we were just sitting right there where he's at his kitchen table, and he told us about a story that our grandmother, Mary Jane, told him when he was young about told history of the Great War, and how the indigenous people, our people, First Nations people, the Blackfeet, whoever, had really won that war. And so I recorded it, and Titus, that's been kind of one of my favorite stories I've been playing on speaker out there in the landscape to people. And, just from a perspective, because both Titus and I are both Army veterans. And so it's kind of also fun to talk about war stories.
When you say Great War, you're referring to World War One. Oh, wow. Really? So were the Blackfeet involved as like a unit, or just how does that connection happen? Because I mean, you hear about the Wind Talkers, you hear about World War II, but I've never heard about the World War One connection.
Well, Titus has a great story about what our grandmother told, and I guess that's kind of one of my favorites. Go ahead, Titus.
Titus, what you got?
Yeah, Titus.
Well, during World War One, we weren't we were not U.S. citizens yet, so we actually didn't have to go to war, but we did, and so they kind of took the tribes that did go join the military and go fight overseas. They kind of took the groups and they put them like the Plains Indians. They put all them together in a company. Indians from the Southwest, they put them in their own company. And so they kind of put them in companies from their geographical areas. And so during World War One, a lot of the Plains Indians, like the Blackfeet, the Crow, the Sioux, the Cheyennes, they all had a what we call a common death song. That this common death song was a song that, let's say, it was 50 Blackfeet and we were surrounded by 300 Crees and we were going to fight with them. Well, we already knew we were going to lose. Okay, we're outnumbered, they're going to get us, but we're going to fight to the death. So these Blackfeet warriors would sing this death song. And vice versa, if it was 300 Blackfeet warriors and we had 100 Crow warriors surrounded, the Crow, you're going to die, but they're going to fight us to the death. So they would start to sing that song. But everybody sang the same song. And so when they put these Plains Indians in this company during World War One, it was, I don't know if you ever heard about the Western Front. It was the trench warfare. Okay. Well, the Plains Indians were at that Western Front. They were in that trench warfare. Of course, you're not going to read about it. But they were there, and some of the boys that came home were telling our grandmother's parents about that war and about the Western Front. And so they were talking about the Plains Indian Company that they were in. And at the time, they were the Americans and the Germans were fighting just over this little strip of land, but thousands were dying on both sides. They would just gain so many feet, and then they'd get overrun by the Germans, and the Germans would gain that back, and then the Americans would overrun the Germans. And it was just going back and forth in this trench warfare. They just couldn't really get a breakthrough. And so my grandmother seen me reading this book. She said, "What you reading?" I said, "Oh, I'm reading about, it's called All Is Quiet on the Western Front." I hadn't anything, she had no idea about it. She said, "Oh, that's that trench warfare." And that's when I learned of the story. And she began to tell me all about it. And I said, "Well, it doesn't talk about the Indians in this book." She said, "Well, I'll tell you what the book won't tell you." So she began to tell us the story. And she says, so what the American Army did is they took that Native American Plains Indian Company and they lined them up and they marched them towards the Germans as pawns. So they knew the Germans were going to attack them. And as the Germans began to would attack this company of soldiers coming and begin to shoot them and take them out, then the American soldiers were going to charge behind that Native American company and overtake the Germans. So that was the strategy to break through. So these Plains Indians still, because it wasn't very long ago, we were fighting, having war with each other on the plains, we still had that song. So what they did is they just held their rifles in their arm, and my grandmother said they picked up sticks off the ground and they began to drum in unison and began to sing the death song as they started to march to their death. So while I was singing this song, this death song, It was the first time these German soldiers ever heard anything like that. This drumming and this singing coming towards them. They never heard nothing like that before. So it panicked them. And so what they did is they just left their weapons and everything. They crawled out of the trenches and they took off. And so this Blackfeet soldier began to tell my grandmother, and he said, when we got to the trenches, the soldiers that didn't run were just petrified because of the singing and drumming coming towards them. He said, and they looked like 16, 17-year-old boys. He says, we felt so bad that we had to bayonet them, and kill them. We didn't want to kill these young little boys, but we had to, and the rest of the German soldiers were retreating. He says, then the Americans, charged and we broke through, and that kind of changed the Western Front there. But that's a story you don't read about or hear about in the history, but that's how they broke through on the Western Front.
That's fascinating.
I would have never known about it if my grandma didn't tell me.
I would do an entire show just on those stories, literally.
Isn't
like that, I would
powerful?
totally do an entire episode just on that, because I love the history. I think it's overall the First World War is such an overlooked event, and then to hear sub stories like that, and to hear I'd never heard anything. That's amazing. No wonder that's one of your favorites.
Oh yes, it's very amazing.
Oh, well, I'm gonna wrap it up here. So just once again, remind us about Iron Shield.
Yeah, Iron Shield Creative is actually named after our grandfather. As you can see, that was his Indian name, Iron Shield. And it is just a great space and place for everybody to come together and understanding of who we are as a Blackfoot people and other tribes. We are going to be expanding across Montana to bringing in other story guides from all the nations here that are now in Montana, and bringing out those stories and those untold histories. So,
and they can visit the website
it's ironshieldcreative.com.
And you're also on Instagram,
TikTok, Facebook,
all the usual
Twitter,
places for everybody.
Everywhere. We might not be that active on Twitter, but we'll be getting there. I just opened it up over a week ago.
Twitter's an interesting beast. I like Instagram because it's a bit more friendly. It's photo oriented. It's, everybody seems a little nicer. So, Lailani Upham and her brother Titus, thank you so much for the time, and thanks for the honesty and the candor and just having an actual discussion. It's been very educational for me, and I hope everyone else.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking to you guys again.
Well, nice to meet you, Eric.
Thanks again, Lailani and Titus Upham, for spending some time with me and having that conversation. That was really insightful. The part about World War I was especially interesting. I'd love to know more about that as a student of history. You grow up in an area like Washington State, and you grow up just side by side with Native Americans, Indians. Now we know, the term depends on who you're talking to. And I'm the first to admit, I didn't learn as much as I should have growing up. So this is a great time to expand that knowledge. But that's, like I'm always saying, that's part of the evolution. That's part of the show. That's part of who I am. And that's part of who I hope you are. And just always learning. So I want to thank them again. Check out ironshieldcreative.com. They're also on Instagram and all the social media sites. I also want to thank Dawn Almery from Vision Maker Media. She's the one who connected me with Lailani, so I really appreciate that. That led to a great conversation, so thanks for that. So I'd encourage you, search out these opportunities. If you are in Montana, take advantage of what Iron Shield offers. Check out their website. Check out some of the stories. Earlier you heard Lailani's grandfather, Joe. We had a snippet from an old audio recording, and just to hear the actual words that were passed down of this tragic event in our history, You know, there's something about the spoken word. There's something about somebody actually passing this down, you know. And one of the things that I'd always wondered about was, you know, you ever play the game telephone? You know, and you somebody tells somebody something and it changes, and by the end it's not even what had begun. And that was something I'd always wondered about with oral traditions. But when you start to talk to people where oral tradition is more than just something they take lightly, it's very important, and those stories are held very closely, and they are not changed, and they are told passionately, but they are told truthfully. So I encourage you to seek out opportunities to hear some of these tales, and Lailani and Titus are some great people to talk to. So thanks for joining me again. Another episode of The Open Highway, and I'm looking forward to more of these journeys with you. So I'll catch you next time. Have a great drive. See you, everyone.